What follows is not a routine escalation narrative, and it is not a continuation of familiar regional patterns that analysts have grown comfortable summarizing in predictable terms. It represents a hypothetical strategic shock scenario in which long-held assumptions about modern deterrence, defense reliability, and escalation control are pushed into an extreme stress environment and begin to fail under their own weight. For decades, global military planning has rested on a quiet confidence that layered defense systems, early warning networks, and rapid response doctrines can contain even complex multi-vector threats if coordination remains intact and reaction times stay within engineered thresholds. But this scenario forces a more uncomfortable question. What happens when the speed of offense compresses decision-making cycles to the point where response becomes structurally late by design? It is in this narrow space between detection and action that modern warfare is increasingly being defined, not by singular acts of destruction, but by the overwhelming synchronization of pressure across multiple domains at once. The moment of rupture is not necessarily loud or visible in real time. It is often recognized only after systems have already failed to align with the tempo of the threat they are facing. And that is where the real tension begins, not in the explosion itself, but in the realization that the architecture built to prevent catastrophe may already be operating outside its intended boundaries. If defense systems are calibrated for yesterday's conflicts, then the central question is no longer whether they can respond, but whether they can even perceive the shape of what is coming fast enough to matter. In this simulated scenario, the timeline itself becomes the most decisive weapon in the entire system, compressing strategic stability into a narrow 38-minute operational window where detection, interpretation, and response collide under extreme time pressure. The engagement begins not with visibility, but with ambiguity. Multiple high-velocity tracks emerging almost simultaneously across a wide radar horizon, forcing early warning systems to transition instantly from monitoring mode into full threat classification. Within seconds, data fusion centers are flooded with overlapping signals that strain the architecture designed to separate noise from intent, while command structures attempt to distinguish between decoys, confirmed trajectories, and potential false positives. The critical failure point is not a single system breakdown, but the cumulative effect of decision latency across interconnected layers: radar interpretation, command authorization, interceptor allocation, and final launch sequencing. Each layer introduces a delay measured in seconds, yet in a compressed battle space, those seconds stack into irreversible gaps between threat and response. As the scenario unfolds, the notion of engagement window begins to collapse into itself. What was once a structured interval for interception becomes a shrinking corridor where opportunities to act vanish faster than they can be validated. Operators are forced into probabilistic decision-making under uncertainty, prioritizing some trajectories while implicitly accepting others as unmanageable within available resources. The psychological weight of this compression is as significant as the technical strain, because every missed or delayed classification becomes immediately visible in the expanding threat picture. By the midpoint of the window, the system is no longer operating as a coordinated defense network, but as a fragmented set of localized reactions, each attempting to compensate for delays elsewhere in the chain. And at the far end of this 38-minute horizon lies the central tension of the simulation. Not whether interception is possible in principle, but whether coherence can survive long enough for defense to remain a meaningful concept at all when time itself becomes the dominant limiting factor. At the core of this simulation lies a paradox that defines nearly every modern missile defense architecture. Systems are designed to achieve near-perfect performance under controlled assumptions, yet they are tested in reality under conditions those assumptions rarely survive. On paper, layered defense networks create a seamless shield. Early detection satellites cue ground-based radar, radar assigns tracking solutions, command centers allocate interceptors, and multiple defensive layers engage in sequence to neutralize incoming threats before impact. Each component is individually optimized, extensively tested, and statistically validated under defined threat loads. But the paradox emerges when these systems are forced into saturation environments where the number, speed, and coordination of incoming objects exceed the designed equilibrium of the network. In such conditions, success is no longer determined by whether a system works, but by whether it can maintain synchronization across all layers without degradation under pressure. Even a highly effective interceptor has limited value if the detection layer is overwhelmed, or if the command layer cannot prioritize targets faster than they are arriving. The result is not a clean failure, but a gradual erosion of efficiency. Tracking confidence drops, engagement priorities shift dynamically, and interceptor allocation becomes increasingly reactive rather than anticipatory. What makes this paradox especially critical is that every defensive success still consumes finite resources. Each interceptor launched reduces future capacity, each radar cycle committed narrows available decision bandwidth, and each misclassification compounds uncertainty in subsequent engagements. In this way, the system can be simultaneously working and still losing structural integrity in real time. The deeper contradiction is that effectiveness is measured in individual intercepts, while survival depends on system-wide coherence under continuous stress. And when that coherence begins to fragment, the defense no longer fails in a single moment. It dissolves progressively, not because any one component is inadequate, but because the system as a whole was never designed to operate indefinitely under maximum simultaneous load. In this simulated framework, one of the most consequential dynamics is the widening gap between weapon evolution and defense adaptation cycles, a gap that increasingly defines the strategic imbalance of modern warfare. Historically, offensive and defensive systems evolved in relatively predictable cycles. New missile technologies would emerge, defenses would adapt over years or even decades, and deterrence would stabilize around a temporary equilibrium. But in a high-speed technological environment, that rhythm begins to fracture. Offensive systems now evolve not only in range or payload, but in trajectory behavior, guidance logic, launch mobility, and coordination patterns, often iterating faster than defense procurement and deployment cycles can realistically respond. The result is a structural lag where defensive systems are perpetually optimized for the last known configuration of threat, rather than the current or emerging one. In this simulation, that lag is not abstract. It manifests in the mismatch between expected interception profiles and actual incoming behavior, where even small changes in speed, altitude depression, or timing synchronization can significantly reduce engagement effectiveness. What intensifies this gap is the compounding nature of adaptation. Once a new offensive pattern proves effective, it is rapidly integrated into broader operational doctrine, scaling from isolated tests into coordinated systems designed specifically to exploit known defensive constraints. Meanwhile, defensive adaptation is constrained by procurement timelines, testing validation requirements, interoperability dependencies, and political oversight, all of which introduce friction into rapid evolution. This creates a structural asymmetry where offensive innovation is iterative and decentralized, while defensive evolution is centralized and slow-moving. The deeper implication is not that defenses are obsolete, but that their relevance is increasingly conditional on accurate prediction of future threat profiles, a prediction that becomes harder as offensive systems deliberately evolve to invalidate those very forecasts. In this environment, superiority is no longer defined by having the most advanced system, but by which side can adapt its operational logic faster than the other can invalidate it. And that temporal race between adaptation and disruption becomes the real battlefield, long before any physical engagement begins. In this simulation, the central shift in modern warfare is not defined by precision alone, but by the emergence of saturation doctrine, a strategic logic in which overwhelming quantity becomes as decisive as technological sophistication. Rather than relying on single high-value strikes designed to penetrate defenses through stealth or accuracy, saturation doctrine operates on the principle of systemic overload, forcing defensive networks to process more simultaneous threats than they can realistically track, prioritize, and intercept within their operational constraints. The effectiveness of this approach does not depend on any individual missile being unstoppable, but on the cumulative probability that enough threats will pass through degraded or delayed response layers to achieve strategic impact. In such a model, even highly capable defense systems are not defeated in a conventional sense. They are outpaced by volume, timing, and coordination. Each layer of defense, detection, tracking, command allocation, and interception has finite throughput capacity, and saturation exploits that limitation by compressing multiple decision cycles into overlapping timeframes where optimal responses are no longer possible. As engagement density increases, systems are forced to prioritize based on incomplete data, accept partial coverage, and make probabilistic decisions about which threats to engage and which to implicitly tolerate. This introduces a critical inversion. The defensive objective shifts from full neutralization to damage management under constraint. Meanwhile, offensive systems leveraging saturation benefit from scalability. Additional launch capacity does not require proportional increases in complexity, only in coordination, timing, and distribution. The doctrine is particularly effective when combined with mixed threat profiles, where varying speeds, trajectories, and signatures further complicate classification and engagement logic. Over time, this produces a structural imbalance where defense becomes increasingly reactive, not because it lacks capability, but because it cannot expand decision throughput at the same rate that offensive volume can scale. In essence, saturation doctrine reframes victory not as the result of breaking defenses through superiority, but as the statistical outcome of exceeding the system's ability to remain coherent under simultaneous stress. In this simulated escalation framework, naval power is placed under a level of structural pressure that challenges many of the foundational assumptions behind modern maritime dominance. For much of the post-Cold War era, naval strategy, particularly carrier strike group doctrine, has been built on the premise of controlled access, that a fleet can project force from relatively secure standoff distances, supported by layered air defense, submarine screening, and integrated aerial surveillance. However, in a threat environment defined by long-range precision missiles, distributed launch platforms, and rapidly compressing engagement windows, the traditional concept of maritime sanctuary begins to erode. The ocean, once viewed as a buffer zone that grants operational freedom, becomes instead a transparent battle space where detection ranges extend far beyond visual horizon, and where threats can arrive with minimal warning from multiple vectors simultaneously. In this context, naval assets are no longer operating in isolation, but within an expanding anti-access envelope that forces them to continuously balance offensive readiness with survivability. The critical vulnerability is not simply firepower disparity, but spatial predictability. Large naval formations, by necessity, concentrate logistical, communication, and operational infrastructure into identifiable zones that can be tracked, modeled, and potentially targeted in advance. As missile range, accuracy, and coordination improve in parallel, the distance between safe operating area and exposed operating area becomes increasingly unstable and context-dependent. This creates a strategic paradox where increasing defensive layering onboard ships does not fully resolve exposure risk, because the threat is no longer limited to direct engagement, but extends to saturation-style strike coordination across time and space. Even advanced fleet defense systems must therefore operate under assumptions of partial information, distributed threats, and reduced reaction margins. The result is a shift in naval doctrine from dominance through presence to survivability through dispersion, mobility, and uncertainty management. And within this simulation, the most important question is no longer whether naval power can project force effectively, but whether it can continue to do so without becoming a predictable target within a battle space where predictability itself is the greatest liability. In this simulated scenario, the most important consequences are not confined to the immediate theater of conflict, but propagate outward through what strategic analysts often describe as ripple effects, second and third order impacts that reshape global behavior long after the initial event has concluded. Strategic shock theory suggests that when a high-visibility military event exposes unexpected limitations in advanced defense systems or deterrence credibility, the effects extend far beyond physical damage and enter the realm of perception, recalibration, and alliance psychology. Markets begin to reprice risk not only based on material destruction, but on perceived stability of security guarantees, logistical continuity, and escalation control mechanisms. Military planners in other regions, even those not directly involved, reassess their own assumptions about vulnerability, timing, and response capacity, particularly in environments where similar technologies or doctrines could be applied. Diplomatic actors, meanwhile, enter a phase of recalibration where public statements may remain unchanged, but internal assessments shift toward contingency planning and scenario diversification. This creates a subtle but powerful divergence between outward alignment and inward uncertainty. Over time, such divergence can weaken the predictability of alliances, not through formal breakdowns, but through incremental hedging behaviors that redistribute trust across multiple security frameworks rather than a single dominant guarantor. Energy markets, supply chains, and insurance systems also respond to this uncertainty by adjusting premiums for risk exposure in regions perceived as newly volatile, amplifying the economic footprint of what may have begun as a localized military simulation. The most significant effect, however, is psychological: the erosion of assumed stability. When systems designed to prevent escalation are shown to be less absolute than previously believed, every actor in the system begins to reassess thresholds of acceptable risk. And in that recalibration process, the world does not immediately become more unstable, but it becomes more conditional, where every assumption of security is now subject to visible exception rather than invisible certainty. In this simulation, the most uncomfortable discovery is not that power is absent, but that power itself has structural limits that become visible only under specific conditions of stress, scale, and coordination. Superpower status has historically been defined by a combination of global force projection, technological superiority, alliance networks, and the ability to shape escalation dynamics faster than adversaries can respond. Yet, when confronted with distributed, high-volume, and rapidly adaptive threat systems, even the most advanced military architectures encounter constraints that are not purely technological, but systemic. These constraints emerge in the form of decision latency, logistical throughput, resource allocation ceilings, and the unavoidable friction between planning cycles and real-time execution. A superpower can possess unmatched individual capabilities: advanced radar, superior aircraft, precision-guided munitions, and integrated command systems, yet still struggle when those capabilities must operate simultaneously at maximum capacity across multiple domains under compressed timeframes. The limitation is not simply about hardware performance, but about coordination bandwidth: how much information a system can process, prioritize, and act upon before the operational environment changes again. In high-intensity scenarios, the speed of events can exceed the speed of institutional decision-making, creating a gap where even optimal responses arrive after the strategic moment has passed. Additionally, global force projection introduces inherent dispersion. Assets are spread across theaters, responsibilities are layered across alliances, and response authority is distributed across political and military structures. This means that even when capability exists, its activation is not instantaneous or uniform. The simulation therefore reveals a deeper truth: superpower strength is not a single unified force, but a network of interdependent systems, each with its own constraints, thresholds, and vulnerabilities. When those systems are stressed simultaneously, the limitation is not collapse, but fragmentation of coherence. And in that fragmentation, the defining question of modern power emerges: not whether dominance exists in theory, but whether it can remain synchronized in practice when every component is being tested at once. In closing this simulation, the goal is not to present a conclusion that feels final, but to open a space where the assumptions underlying modern security thinking can be examined with greater clarity and less certainty. If there is one consistent thread running through all previous sections, it is that stability in today's strategic environment is no longer defined by the absence of capability, but by the reliability of coordination under pressure, and the speed at which systems can adapt when those pressures exceed expected thresholds. The real question is not whether advanced defense architectures exist, they clearly do, but whether their performance remains consistent when confronted with scenarios that combine scale, speed, and synchronization in ways that push them beyond designed operating margins. This is where traditional narratives of strength begin to lose precision, because power is no longer measured only in assets or platforms, but in responsiveness under stress and coherence under uncertainty. As you reflect on this, consider how quickly perceptions of security can shift when theoretical guarantees are tested against operational realities, and how rapidly strategic confidence can be recalibrated when systems behave differently than expected under extreme load conditions. The implications extend beyond any single region or conflict model, touching instead the broader architecture of global stability itself. And so the final question is not about one event or one scenario, but about the structure of the future we are building without fully recognizing its constraints. If every layer of modern defense depends on synchronization, and every act of offense increasingly targets that synchronization itself, then what does security actually mean in a world where timing may matter more than strength, and coordination may matter more than capability? If this analysis challenged your assumptions, engage with it, question it, and compare it with other perspectives. Because understanding modern conflict is no longer about accepting conclusions, but about testing the systems that produce them.